Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. I'm your host, Coleman Hughes. Just one announcement before we get to today's guest. You can now support this podcast directly through my website at colemanhughes.org rather than going to Patreon. I've gotten a lot of comments from people who want to support my podcast, but can't because they, in principle, don't support Patreon. And I agree with their reasoning, which is that Patreon has been known to sometimes deplatform content creators that don't pass its political purity test. And while I don't have any immediate fear that I'm going to become a victim of their political bias, it's a problem that I ever have to think about it at all. So because of that, I've created an option for supporting me directly through my website. And I encourage you, if you have a moment, to switch over from Patreon, stop being a patron there, and move over to my website and give the same amount. And certainly if you're deciding to support the podcast for the first time, I ask that you do it through my website rather than through Patreon. Every so often, I feel I should remind listeners that percent of you who donate is in the single digits. And I am truly grateful for everyone who does, because the quality and the pace of output of this podcast is a direct result of how many people support it. If you've noticed, I'm only doing 2 podcasts a month. The reason is that I would need more people to support the podcast before it became financially feasible for me to create more. I'm editing each episode myself. If more people support the podcast, I can outsource the editing and spend more time preparing for the guests themselves. I could afford to send a mic to each guest so that I could do remote episodes more easily. So if you appreciate what I'm doing and you have the means, please do go to my website at colemanhughes.org and donate. My guest today is Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas is a contributing writer to New York Times Magazine and a columnist at Harper's. He's written 2 memoirs, both of which I really recommend. One is called Losing My Cool, and the more recent one, which we talk about in this episode, is Self-Portrait in Black and White. We talk about Thomas's background growing up in a mixed-race household. We talk about race as a social construct. We talk about identity politics, the conflict between race consciousness and color blindness, reparations, affirmative action, the SAT's adversity score initiative, the logic of diversity, Asian American overachievement, the relationship between agency and race. We talk about Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, and related ideas. We talk about the relationship between privilege and living a meaningful life. And finally, we talk about the difference between France, where Thomas now lives, and America, and in particular, the French system of official legalized colorblindness. Due to a technical mess-up, we lost the video for this episode. So this is an audio-only episode. And because it's a long episode, I'm going to put the second half behind a paywall. The first hour or so is available to all. So without further ado, Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I read your first book, Losing My Cool, which is a memoir, and was astounded by how many similarities we have in our lives, in our past. It hit very close to home, almost too close to home. I really couldn't put it down. And so, like, we both grew up in New Jersey, not that far from each other.
Where were you?
Montclair.
Oh, yeah, that's very close, yeah.
And you talk about, I think in your book you talk about hanging out in the Maplewood area, which I had a lot of friends there, and you talk about, you almost went to the Del Barton High School, which was my high school's main rival, although rival implies that we ever had a chance beating
beat you.
them. Yeah, they beat us. But we grew up about 15 years apart. You were born in 81? Yeah. So I was born in 96.
That's sobering and humbling.
Yeah. So talk about your background a little bit. How did you come to think about race as a social construct? What in your past led you to be emotionally motivated to explore these ideas as a writer?
Sure. So my father is really old enough to be my grandfather, and so he just turned 82, born in 1937. He's from the South. He's had a really Black American experience, from the South. He is exactly between slavery and my children in terms of generational position. His grandfather was born in the last year of chattel slavery, and his grandchildren now are, equally distant from him.
He's from Texas, right?
Yeah, Galveston, Texas. And he's a sociologist by training, and my mother is too. And my mother's white, the daughter of evangelical Christians from San Diego, and the only one in her family to kind of break free of that kind of small social world and kind of get out into the world. She went to school in Illinois and volunteered at soup kitchens in Chicago, and she just never saw race the way that the people she grew up with did. So by the time that my brother and I were coming up in New Jersey, and my brother in the 70s and me in the 80s, 90s, we were just in a house where my father would say things like, your mother is not white, she's just light-skinned because she's got black consciousness, and none of this is real anyway. But he would also really talk to us about racism and about how real the effects of this racial construct are, and I could see with my own eyes how his life had been impacted by race. So from a very young age, far before I could articulate it, I understood that there was a kind of absurdity and a tension and a contradiction, that my dad and my mom didn't believe in race, and I didn't really believe in race, because how can you have a parent that's a different race than you, But I also very much was raised with the idea that the one-drop rule obtains, that my brother and I were black, and that it was a kind of, it was like arguing how many angels can stand on the head of a needle to say that we were biracial, because my father raised us to think and to truly believe, and it probably was the case when we were growing up, that wouldn't matter very much in certain situations. It was only when I had children of my own that some of these things from my childhood really began to cohere into an understanding that to transcend racism, to get past some of these things, and it's going to be very difficult if it's going to happen at all, we're going to have to kind of get rid of the categories that we operate in. These categories have failed us, and so I have a kind of personal, I have a lot of biographical experience with exposure to the fiction of race.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit before we talk about how that's changed over the course of your lifetime, and then talk maybe more broadly about what it means for something to be a social construct. So what, roll back the clock, you're 15 or 16 or 17. What does it mean for you, Thomas, to be black at that time?
That would put me in the mid-90s. I would call that that's prime hip hop era, Losing My Cool was very much a memoir about learning to perform a kind of racial authenticity that was very much glamorized and sold back to all Americans through hip hop culture, but that was very much tied up with my sense of myself and my peer group's sense of themselves. So I'm 15, and being black was the word I come back to over and over again is a performance. And I'm aware of the fact that when you're mixed, you can kind of approach these things with the fervency of the convert. You can overperform to overcompensate. You're light-skinned, people are aware you have a white mother. You want to prove that you're not, an imposter. But yeah, I just immersed myself in not the music of hip-hop itself, but the idea of hip-hop as a kind of all-consuming secular religion, a culture that informed everything from the way I shook hands to the way I dressed to the types of schools I thought were appealing to me. I chose not to go to Del Barden because that was too far away from an idea of authentic hip-hop era blackness in my mind.
So talk about how the birth of your daughter changed that, if at all. What was that? What was it like for you to father someone who was so sort of unambiguously white in how she looked, how she presented herself? Blue eyes, right?
Blue eyes, blonde hair, very, very white skin. The main thing is that her hair is very curly, so that's the one incongruity. But, I just want to say, by the time I got to Georgetown, studied philosophy, went to college, became an adult in my 20s, I didn't have this kind of overcompensatory, performative racial identity But I did still really have deep inside me the idea that race was binary, even if it was a construct. It was binary, and you were either black or you were white.
Yeah, looking at the pictures of you had this nice excerpt in New York Times Magazine of your book, which I recommend everyone read. And you had these old pictures of you, and there's a picture of you. You look about 13 years old, maybe, and having grown up in roughly the same place as you. If I had seen you at that time, you would have been clearly black to me,
Right.
In the black category because of how your hair was, just the
so much of race has to do with hair.
Yeah, it has a lot to do with hair. It has something to do with subtle facial phenotypical traits that are tough to describe, but one knows when one sees. So it's easy for me to see how, as a kid, despite being fairly light-skinned, you would have been fairly easily categorizable as black.
Yeah, the white kids didn't think of my brother and me as white, and
Right.
the black kids basically are accustomed to accepting a wide variety of.
That's right.
And
you note in your book that quote unquote black people in America really do run the gamut. And I think you say that, despite your daughter being sort of blonde and blue-eyed, your father, who grew up in segregated Texas under Jim Crow, remembers quote unquote black kids going to segregated schools with him that looked more or less like your daughter did.
Absolutely.
Right.
I loved his response to when she was born. My parents came about 2 weeks after my daughter was born to Paris to see her. And, I looked at him and I said, well, she's not so black looking, is she? And he said, oh, son, she's just a palomino. It's like, he's got these words from the South.
Quadroon, octoroon, mulatto.
Yeah. Palomino is like a type of horse that's like, white to blonde hair, But he's like, I had 2 or 3 classmates that looked like this. He said, the idea of the other is false. It's always been like this. There have always been people like this on the segregated side of town. There have always been, sometimes those people disappeared into the larger population. This is part of the reason why so many white Americans, without even knowing it, have enough, theoretically have enough sub-Saharan African DNA within them to have been enslaved under, the strictest laws of hypodescent that used to obtain in the South.
Was it 1/32 black?
1/32. If you think
officially,
about that,
quote, colored?
my daughter can basically pass anywhere in Europe. She's a 4th. She's like a 5th. But to get down to 1/32, I mean, this is nuts. But there are millions of white Americans who have 1/32 black blood in them at this point.
Right. Which is to say, there are millions of white Americans who are more white than Elizabeth Warren is Native American.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the idea of race as a social construct in general. What does that mean to you? How does that cut against prevailing notions of race? And do you oppose that with racial essentialism or with the notion that race is a biologically valid concept? How do you parse that question?
Yeah, well, I reject the idea that race is a biological essence that is, that is identifiable, measurable, significant. This is something that a lot of people on the left will say, like, yeah, okay, we all know that. But actually, this is coming back with some. This is not something that everybody accepts. And I in the summer of 2017 spent a lot of time talking to explicitly white supremacist thinkers in Europe and America for a piece I was doing for the New Yorker on the French origins of this idea of replacement that became Richard Spencer's and Charlottesville's rallying cry. Someone like Richard Spencer, who I interviewed, he'll just say, of course he believes in biological race. So do the French thinkers like Alain de Benoit and some of these people that are inspiring the Americans, whether they know it or not. They do actually believe that there is something to biological race. Nowadays, on the left, we might talk about like population pools or things like that. But the human being is too malleable for me to, for me to accept that. What we really talk about on the left more is the idea that race is a rigid social category that you can't transcend, no matter no matter how much you would want to. I get a lot of skepticism from people that hold the two ideas at the same time. Race is not a essence, but essentially it's socially constructed to the point where we have to behave as though it is an essence. And that's what I'm pushing back against a lot on the left. I think I'm not spending too much time arguing about biological race, though that is part of the book, because I think you have to mention that everybody doesn't accept this at face value.
Yeah, so the argument from the left now is definitely not that race is a biologically valid concept, although I think most people would recognize that given the categories as we've drawn them, there are some differences in terms of like your susceptibility to get certain diseases like Tay-Sachs.
Sure. That's population groups, though.
Right.
Because we always talk about, and people, in the comments to an article I wrote recently, I saw this, people will say, but of course it's not real, but sickle cell is a black disease.
Right.
But no, but Greeks get sickle cell too. It's about where your population group is bringing, why you developed that, because I believe it's for protecting groups against malaria. So it's not about, there's nothing essentially linked to blackness about having the sickle cell trait. Other groups can have it too. Whenever you try to identify the thing that makes somebody black or white, you can never pinpoint that thing.
That's right. But there's a left-wing flavor of essentialism that you rightly point out is a matter of thinking that race is a socially rigid category that you cannot choose to escape.
Right.
They would attack you on the grounds that you, Thomas, at least as a kid, as a young black man growing up, someone seen as black, and perhaps you had a kind of colorist privilege since you were light-skinned, but nevertheless, you were seen as black by the surrounding society. Therefore, you ought to identify as black. You have to identify as black. It's not a choice. It's that there's no individual agency. It's really a matter that when you come into contact with a policeman, whether you like it or not, you will be seen as black. And I've gotten this many times as well when I try to, however tepidly defend a kind of individualist, universalist human ethic where I feel that I'm Coleman first before I am whatever social category you want to put on me. Well, that doesn't really matter because when you get pulled over by the cops, you're going to be black in that instance. And then there's an implied, therefore, you ought to identify blackness as an important part of your identity all of the time. And I think you rightly point out that this is something of a fallacy, right? Like, how do you view that argument?
I think there's a couple problems with that. The first is that whether cops identify you by something that's not real or not, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should just accept their definition of you. I think that one has to still define oneself. If race doesn't exist, and I use an example of this, I live in France now. In France, my race is, your identity is always what you think of yourself and what society reflects back at you. I understand that you can't just walk around, I can't just say I'm Japanese. No, society will not recognize that. It's a negotiation. But in France, I'm not read as an African-American man. When I walk down the street, I'm typically thought to be, and sometimes I'm profiled as, a North African. And that comes with actual consequences in airports and stuff. Like, I'm treated as an identity. I'm not going to go and start thinking of myself as a North African because that's how I'm treated by society. And I don't think that if you have a serious rejection of race as a valid way of organizing human beings, that you should just accept the idea of yourself as black because cops will treat you as though you're black. I think that you have to deal with the actual reality. I still have to be careful that profiling can affect me, but I still have to maintain my own idea of myself, and I have to articulate that idea of myself and push back against what society imposes on me.
So earlier you mentioned something that your father said about your mother. Your mother was what we would call white. Father is what we would call black. I almost feel the urge to put scare quotes around all of these words in this conversation.
Well, because he's heavily descended from Europe as well.
Right, that's right. As are most black people are something like what, 20%?
The averages range from the average African American has between 73 and 80% sub-Saharan sub-Saharan African
Right.
DNA. That's a lot of Europe. That's up to 27%, almost all European, because most
Right.
African Americans actually don't have significant Native American in them.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost all European.
Right. So one thing, despite that your father would say about your mother, as you mentioned earlier, is she has a black consciousness. So he would joke that she's not really white; she's just light skinned. To me, I don't know how that reads to you, but does that read as a statement about how we transcend racial categories, or does it not read as a kind of racial essentialism of its own because it implies it's like almost dualist in the philosophical sense that we have a mind and we have a body and a soul, and they can be mismatched.
I think he's being fun. I think he was saying those statements in joking situations, and
Right.
I think there was a little bit of truth to his joke. He was saying that she has an achieved perspective, is what he was saying. He was saying that she's consciously thought about her social position in society as white, and for not all intents and purposes, but for a lot of intents and purposes, she began living in a pretty socially black life. She had a black husband and 2 black sons in society who, could be stopped and were stopped. My brother was beaten by cops. He had his teeth knocked out by police in front of my parents. She was dealing with situations that typically come to black people and wouldn't come to her if she were not living, if she made different life decisions. And she was aware of what that meant, and she was aware of what she was giving up and what she was gaining. I would say too, she was aware of what she was gaining by leaving a kind of tribally insulated world that she was raised in. And so he would say she achieved a perspective that there's nothing essential about it. There's nothing about her skin or her blood about it, but that she's aware of blackness. You see what I'm saying? She has that perspective, but of course he's aware of the irony, and he's making a joke. Of course she's a white lady, and he's aware that when she walks out in the world, people don't think much about what her consciousness is. She's treated as such.
Yeah. When I read that quote, I chuckled, and I did think it was funny. But it reminded me of something that Ayanna Pressley said recently, not jokingly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without the layer of irony that makes it funny rather than upsetting, which was something along the lines of
black voices.
Yeah, we don't need black faces that aren't black voices. Right. We don't need Hispanic faces that aren't Hispanic voices, implying that it's possible to be in a black body but not have the correct black thought.
Right. That's a very dangerous and old kind of critique, and it always raises the question: who decides? Who gets to decide what's an authentic black voice? Because that means that there's only one acceptable way to speak, and any deviation from that, you lose your racial authenticity. That's again what we're getting back to when we're talking about how, as a teenager, I kind of very simplistically thought that there was one way of behaving that would increase my black authenticity, my racial legitimacy, and there's one way that would be a deviation from that. I think that's a very, very, very pernicious kind of thought to creep into the progressive leftist identity politics discourse. And I don't know that she was making that statement entirely aware of how dangerous that statement is. I think that in a lot of these cases, people are saying things that reach back to bigger conversations, meaning something smaller than that. I'm not sure what her intentions were with that.
That's right, yeah. It also strikes me that the same argument that you made against biological essentialism also refutes the social essentialism of the left, which is to say there is no race that cannot get sickle cell or Tay-Sachs, I think, right? There's no one attribute you can find
that you can ever pinpoint. Yeah.
That you can pinpoint. That I think is also arguably true of social. So like you can look up.
There's no group that can't be shot by police.
That's right. I mean, and look up the video of Daniel Shaver getting shot,
begging for his life.
Begging for his life. If you doubt that, which is not to say that it is equally prevalent among every race. Obviously, on almost any sort of racist insult that you can think of, black people have been far more subject to it than probably any other race in the American context, at least, which is not to say that there is any group that has been devoid of historical oppression of some kind, at least if you go back long enough. So it also refutes the essentialism of the left to note that
Well, yeah, I think that what you're saying makes the argument for why the best way to treat some of these things is to have holistic kind of, you want to have like criminal justice reform that would actually treat this malady no matter who it afflicts.
Right.
And not pinpoint a single group. Although fixing police-citizen interactions would disproportionately help blacks, but even more than blacks, it would disproportionately help Native Americans who are killed by police at extraordinary rates. It's like 10.9 for Native Americans. It's
right?
6.66 for blacks, 2.9 for whites, and it's
This
like
is per
0.2% or something like that for Asians.
per 100,000 or something.
Per million.
Per million. Okay.
Yeah. So actually, these are low numbers for everybody, but Native Americans are almost twice as likely as blacks to be killed by police.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So that leads into the conversation about color blindness. How should our policies recognize or not the dimension of race? And this is usually opposed to what's called color consciousness or race consciousness. And it's related to the conversation about whether race is socially constructed, but it's not determined by that conversation, which is to say you can think race is a social construct and still be race conscious or be against colorblindness or in favor of it. I've thought recently that colorblindness really has a PR problem in the sense that, so for example, Bernie Sanders several months ago said something along the lines of, we should not be electing politicians based on their skin color. Right. We should really be electing them based on their policies, which to me read like a straightforward indication that the person talking is sane. And I mean, it's almost right from Martin Luther King. There's a very similar quote that he wrote, and I think, where do we go from here? In any case, even 10 years ago, I think, probably 5 years ago, that statement would have gone down smooth with American media, but in 2019, it didn't. The following night, he was laughed at, mocked by Colbert on the Late Show, and Colbert is hardly a radical, right? He's pretty center left. I find him reasonable most of the time. How do you see the evolution of the notion of colorblindness in the past maybe 5 years? Where do you stand, if you accept the dichotomy at all in the debate between colorblindness and race consciousness?
Sure. I mean, I think that you're absolutely correct that we're in a very different place than even 5 years ago. We're certainly in a different place than President Obama's first term. Colorblindness is something that's laughed at. I understand. I'm sensitive to the issue because I do think that life experiences, I don't think there's anything essential about it. There's nothing in your bones that makes you see things a certain way. There's nothing in your genes. Life experiences impact what you're aware of. So I look at something outside of the race conversation, the recent discussion in the past couple of years around Me Too, right? There's just a lot of experiences that many women go through that I hadn't ever thought of before. So you could say that having women in certain positions, it's not just that it doesn't matter who enacts policies because the policies are all that matter. It means that they might have ideas or bring up policies that would escape me because it just wouldn't occur to me. And so we probably do have to have, or I'm certain that we do have to have viewpoint diversity, right? I'm not saying that I can't come to the same conclusions that a woman can because I'm anatomically a male, but I'm saying that my life has taken me in directions where I'm willing to admit that I miss certain things. I can imagine that Bernie Sanders misses certain things about certain minority experiences, even though I'm sure there's nothing that prevents him from ever being able to understand those things. So we're probably not at a stage where we can talk seriously about absolute colorblindness if we think that, black people, Latinos, women, Jews, they tend to have life experiences that can lead them to conclusions that escape people that are not having those life experiences.
When it comes to politicians or leaders, though, I feel that argument So if the argument is that one's identity is a proxy, an imperfect one, but a decent one, for the people you're going to advocate for, the things you're going to think of that, say, a white person would not have thought of. So that's why I'm pro black politicians on balance, right? It seems like if the identity is a proxy for the policies or the way of thinking, if we can just look at the policies, then we don't need the proxy. And
I agree. No, I
in
agree.
practice, that's what people do. The moment you're talking about Clarence Thomas, no one says like, well, the fact that he's black means he's likely to institute pro-black policies. Then there's a laser sharp focus on what his actual decisions were and all the ways in which they allegedly harm black people, right? So I do think there is an argument actually for racially diverse politicians. Like I think the United States would be much worse off, if the Senate were only white people.
I'm certain of it.
In terms of people seeing themselves reflected in the governing body of the country for social
the power
cohesion.
of symbolism. Yeah, symbols do matter.
Yeah.
But it's true that, I mean, I would say that Clarence Thomas's extreme conservatism is probably actually like closely linked to his identity. It's just it's an extreme reaction to his identity. But I mean, I think that it's difficult to make the case that an entirely white Senate would make no difference.
Right. Even if I agree, even if you held the policies constant,
Right.
like just picture Kamala Harris believing everything she does, but she's white.
Right.
I think, and likewise for Cory Booker, whomever else, I think that's worse because it's just bound to lead black people to feel less a part of the nation.
Right. I mean,
so
how old were you when Barack Obama was elected?
12, I think.
What did that mean to you? I mean, you're young enough that you took it as kind of normal, but it must have meant something, right? To a 12-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, it meant something because I could feel how meaningful it was to my parents and my grandparents. Because if you had asked almost any black person in 2006, 2007,
right,
are we going to get a black president in our lifetime? It was like a reflexive and knowing no.
Impossible.
Impossible. And what was behind that reaction was the sense that the country isn't there yet. Many of the people saying that have had many racist experiences in their lifetime. There was nothing about George Bush's presidency that really signaled that we were about to have a black president, although Bush was, by no means an Archie Bunker type either. But the sense was, and this is a point that I often think about, having a black president would be too meaningful. It would mean that we had made some kind of progress that I think we haven't. Therefore, I don't think we're going to have one. However, in retrospect, now, if you say that Barack Obama's presidency was a landmark moment for race relations,
there's such
you get
cynicism.
Something akin to an eye roll.
Yeah. It didn't mean anything. Now.
It didn't mean anything. But then why were we doubting that it was going to happen before? Right. That's a direct contradiction, I think. And it makes me feel that, at least on the left right now, politics is identity politics, especially, is not about progress. It's the moment there is something that before it happens, we define as monumental, but then after it happens, we define as sort of
big shrug,
we define with a shrug. We're pocketing these gains so quickly. It implies to me that progress is not really at the core of the kind of politics that is practiced on the left, at least, on the far left.
Well, it's very difficult to. How do you measure when you've progressed enough to feel that, like, will the playing field ever be completely level? I mean, how do you level the playing field completely? How is a human life ever equal to another? But when do you reach a point where you say, things have largely improved? And I think that that's something that can never happen for enormous numbers of people all at the same time. I think some people level out the playing field at times when others don't. And then, but we have conversations as though this is what is so troubling about identity politics or speaking about people in large abstract color categories. We don't have the same experiences. You are already probably living a more or less leveled out life. There are a lot of black people who are too. So we miss so much complexity and nuance of what it means to have progressed, and so when we reject the idea that there was a black president, it seems as though nothing can ever happen for us there can never be enough the way that the conversation is set up.
That's right. And that was one of my reasons for opposing reparations paid to all descendants of slaves, at least if reparations is meant as a sort of check with slavery in the memo line, which many people mean it to, intend it to mean broader structural reforms.
Right.
But reparations as a check, one of the points that I've made is that 5 years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote The Case for Reparations for The Atlantic, sort of bombshell essay about the topic that renewed public interest in it. And in that piece, he said there was no way that the idea of reparations could enter the political mainstream because America's not ready, which reminded me of the arguments many people made before Obama. And I don't think it was crazy at the time. I mean, I probably would have agreed if you had asked me.
But then every single mainstream Democratic candidate now puts that on their agenda,
Right.
And it happened overnight.
That's right.
In retrospect.
Right. Which to me, it's the same thing. When you make a prediction based on your model of America as fundamentally racist, and that prediction turns out to be wrong. It turns out to be that actually reparations is in the mainstream, whether or not it happens.
It doesn't correct your fundamentally negative assessment, though.
Right.
It makes no
dent on the model.
Not at all. Yeah.
Although it should.
Right. And I'm interested in talking about essentialism, and you're much more acquainted with these arguments than I am. What does reparations actually mean, and how do you measure a black life in a country as mixed up as America? My children, my Swedish-looking children, are American descendants of slaves. At what point do you become a life that is too far away from the experience to merit repair, or does it matter that socially they've inherited less wealth through the generations? I have no idea. It seems to me that it's impossible for me to, when you talk about affirmative action or things like this, it's impossible for me to, with a clear conscience, allow my kids, for example, to ever apply to a school and mark a box that would have them get extra consideration for being black, even though they're descended from slaves. I wouldn't have them mark white. I would have them mark nothing or other. Mm-hmm. But you know what I mean?
No, yeah. I mean, I felt the same guilt marking the black box, even though I'm unambiguously seen as black in this country. Although if I went to Africa, I would be relatively light-skinned. Here, I'm sort of center, like in the middle of the blackness skin spectrum, I think. But knowing the advantages that come along with that, at least in the spheres I run in, knowing that, if we're talking about the social ladder that someone like me would be climbing if I were more into investment banking or consulting or tech, knowing that almost all of these companies I'd be applying to are starving for people with black skin. And they don't necessarily care that those people are descendants of American slavery. It's just as good from their point of view
if you're Nigerian.
If you're Nigerian. Totally. But I've also felt that guilt. And my friend Desiree Campbell, who is Jamaican, lives in the States now, and very dark-skinned. She actually intentionally does not check the black box because she is so committed to knowing that whatever she got it because she's Desiree, not because she's black. And she identifies similar to our friend Camille Foster.
She's a race abolitionist?
She's a race abolitionist in the sense that she says she's Jamaican, if you ask her. And the notion of blackness is foreign to her. Obviously, she grew up in Jamaica where almost everyone is black. So like many people from Africa as well, if you grow up and everyone is black, you're like a fish in water, and there's no reason for you to ever recognize that you are, quote, black.
No, blackness and whiteness function on a binary. They're only meaningful in opposition to the other.
That's right. Yeah. So talking about leveling out the playing field, let's talk about the SAT's adversity score. Can you describe this, and what is your take on this attempt to level out the playing field?
I wrote an op-ed in the Times when this was announced last spring, And I found myself in a bizarre position of actually debating David Coleman, or it wasn't much of a debate. We were both on NPR on the same show, and he kind of refused to respond to any of the points that I made. But the SAT, the College Board, which administers the SAT, introduced a measure, an adversity index, dashboard they call it, on a scale of 0 to 100, measures, takes in many factors and measures whether you've had a adverse or privileged life. And, it standardizes this, and the results are not shown to students and applicants, but they're released to schools in addition to your scores. And
they come up with a weighted score, right? Is that
no, your score is your score.
Your score.
Your test score is your score. But in addition to that, you have the adversity index applied.
So they just give you the adversity index, but they don't give you a adversity adjusted score as well?
No.
Just
they
the
don't
index.
do that. No.
Okay.
But they say it helps them identify kids who have really overcome some tough odds, and I'm sure that it does. I don't want to downplay that, but I also think that there's some hubris involved, and it's just contrary to how human life works to think that you can measure and standardize adversity in a life. You can come from many forms of adversity. Some of the kids who had, and I'm not saying this in a glib way, some of the kids that I knew who had some of the worst problems to overcome when they arrived in school were some of the wealthier kids that I'd met who came from very unloving families, like families that will mess you up for the rest of your life, but they lived in a good neighborhood, And what does it mean to hit them with the full privilege score? And to give, I use the example of my best friend from high school who would have scored off the charts on the adversity index, but this is not measurable. He was coming over my house every day after school, studying with my father, who was, teaching us for hours every day SAT prep work. He got a good enough score to go to Syracuse and kept studying with my father and aced the LSAT and went to Harvard and Oxford. And in every way was from a loving family. And just because the neighborhood he came from, it looks as though he was from an adverse social context, but he had all kinds of support that kids I have known who would be thought of as privileged did not have.
Right.
And these are just two individuals. You can never prove a universal by a particular, but I just use these examples to say that how do you measure privilege? How do you measure adversity? How do you measure difficulty? How do you measure sorrow? We all react to these things different. Some people are more resilient. I mean, these are intensely complex things, and to dole out scores that are then used in private, I think it's just it's getting away from where we ought to be going.
So let me provide a counter argument, because my initial response was to agree with you, to think that the adversity index was silly and hubristic, and I actually still think that it is. Obviously, there is some signal in the noise if you're measuring the crime rate where someone grew up, I think the graduation rate at the high school, average income in the neighborhood. You're going to do an okay job of predicting who had adversity and who didn't. But like you, I know someone who grew up in essentially a mansion or a very big house and was beat by their parents
you cannot measure
regularly.
That's not going to be measured.
It's not measured at all. So there is something sort of bean counting and farcical and scientistic in the sense of over relying on science or having the pretense of accuracy where you don't have it. On the other hand, compared to what? The question is the adversity index. The question might not be, is the adversity index good in the abstract, to which we might answer no, it's very bad. But is it better than what we have now? So the question is, what do we have now? Right now, we kind of have a system of college admissions that, perhaps without stating it explicitly, believes that to be black is to have had a life of adversity. So that's why we're going to give black people a leg up in admissions. I guess that kind of used to be the argument more than it is now. Now there's this term diversity.
Well, yeah, and
right?
that's where Glenn Lowry is rather convincing on this. I think when you move to the goal of diversity in itself, you concede quite a lot. I don't feel as strongly about it as Glenn does, but I find it difficult to contradict him here. When diversity is the goal, and you have blacks and Latinos who basically would not be in these campuses in great numbers on test scores alone, you basically say that it's edifying for white people to have them around, and that they just have to be there. Mm-hmm. And when you do that in perpetuity, you really reify a kind of white supremacy that we're trying to contradict, actually, right? You have two standards, and you basically say that their presence, it's not deserved, but it's good for everybody. Mm. That's incredible. On one level, it's insulting. On another level, it's just, I mean, think about it. If that's really the way that college education is set up, I mean, you actually can't get to an equal situation.
Mm. Well, I think I agree with that, but I'm hearing a counter argument, which is, it's not that we're saying black people are good for the white people on campus. It's that we're saying society is so racist, so structurally racist in ways that are sort of invisible to the naked eye, but nevertheless very constraining, that what we're trying to do with affirmative action is just put a thumb on the scale so that black students who, if they had the advantage that the average white student had, would have gotten into Harvard, but because they didn't have the money for coaching, they didn't have the sort of cultural knowledge that they should be applying to all these places to begin with. I was walking on Columbia campus the other day, and I saw a flyer that said something like 50% of high-achieving, low-income students don't apply to an Ivy League college because they don't know to.
Right. That's actually an important issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree as well. I think a lot of people who don't know anyone who have gone to college just naively assume.
That's an enormous barrier.
Right. It's not even a talent barrier.
The social capital of understanding what's even out there and possible.
Right. My mom, for example, who was brilliant, went to Stuyvesant from the South Bronx, didn't apply to college because she didn't know anyone who had gone. And some recruiter just found her test scores and was like, oh my God, you need to go to college, and just plucked her. But I think there are many people in that situation who maybe don't get plucked. That's kind of an empirical question. But I guess back to the adversity score. Could you not see an argument that this is better than the current regime? If this were to replace the current regime of sort of assuming that black people are at a disadvantage, that Asians are at an advantage. I guess that's the implicit logic in the system.
The Asian part is what always I stumble on, because, and you've written about this yourself quite convincingly. I think you were talking about this on Sam Harris's podcast, or he brought it up with you. In this article about Asians in their cram schools getting Chinese American immigrants in Flushing, Queens getting, into the specialized schools like Stuyvesant at greater rates than everybody else. There was a throwaway line in the article that Sam mentioned, which was like, many of them go without lunch to pay for these.
Yeah, no, I think I mentioned that. Yeah, they scrimp on essentials like food to pay for test prep.
But that's neither here nor there.
That's neither here nor there. Yeah,
but that's everything.
Exactly. They wrote about it as if it was a throwaway line.
As though they have a structural advantage.
Right.
That destroys the entire argument.
It really does.
Concerned. I'm willing to accept the fact that a lot of white mediocrity gets elevated or just can never hit below a certain floor, and that a lot of black and Latino talent just doesn't get a shot. But the idea that it can't be done is what I kind of reject, and this is what I was trying to make clear on NPR with David Coleman from the College Board. Is that my father, I wasn't raised in privilege. The privilege that I had was I had a two-parent loving home, and I had an educated father that really spent time on my education and insisted that was important. This is what a lot of immigrant families actually do, with or without social capital, or cultural capital, or money, And so I do think that this is probably. You're right. I'm willing to admit this is probably better in some ways if it identifies overlooked talent. but it's a horrible situation, and I think the idea of values at some point, and cultural traditions, and effort, and just resilience has to come into the conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I completely agree. But it's seen as quote unquote blaming the victim.
Of course, it
It's
is.
seen as a right wing talking point to actually even mention Asian American achievement in this conversation.
It's one of the most. It's one of the things I cannot understand the most. But
Yeah.
we in America, we don't know how to talk about any of the racial complexity, any of the identity complexity that doesn't hit on the black-white binary very well.
That's right.
This we stumble on this constantly. We don't know what to do with Asians.
Right. So we end up just not talking about them.
Right. We don't talk about the fact that the majority of them, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I know for a fact the majority of them in New York City are from low-income families.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And, and it also throws a wrinkle in the idea that the tests or the society in general is tilted towards a white sort of, it's built for white people to succeed because it's built on white values.
Richard Carranza,
Yeah.
the
Chancellor of
New
New York City Public Schools, right?
I'm sure you've seen it. He released
Yeah.
his points for teacher training to get rid of white supremacy culture or to help eradicate it. Aspects of white supremacy culture that he and his staff had identified were things like objectivity, emphasis on the written word.
Yeah, right. Like grammar, like proper grammar.
It's incredibly
Racist to
insulting.
assume that grammar and the insistence on proper grammar is a manifestation of white supremacy culture. What that implies is that black students cannot be expected to have proper grammar because this is a value that white America is imposing on
and
other
that black
races
America
without
somehow
knowing.
the implication that black America rejects, which is not the
Yes.
black America that I'm familiar with.
Nor is it the one that I'm familiar with.
And this is James Baldwin's point. When the category is the only thing that matters and can't be transcended, you end up reinforcing the very aspects of social life that you want to transcend. When all that matters is that whiteness and white supremacy culture have these attributes don't apply to blacks. You just reinforce the very inequality you're supposedly trying to bridge.
Yeah.
So long as there are separate standards, there's always going to be an imposed hierarchy that comes with that.
So, I was talking recently to someone who is actually a superintendent of schools in New York about this very topic, about why it is that Black and Hispanic students are doing worse, what needs to be done. And her viewpoint, to put it as charitably as possible, was that the problem largely is white people. It's that most white people don't know enough about structural racism. They are not aware that they themselves are biased in ways that they can't recognize. The solution has to be, as Richard Carranza has done, to spend some $20 million on implicit bias trainings to essentially teach white people to expand their perspective, to understand to the extent that they can what it's like to be Black, and to practice observing racism in action in very subtle ways throughout society. So she had all of these stories that I think you and I have both been on the wrong end of little subtle ways in which racism can pervade everyday life. Comments someone makes to you that they wouldn't have made to you if you were white. Yeah, what is sometimes called microaggressions. The idea is that what we need to be doing in order to make life better for Black people, particularly for Black people at the bottom of society, is for white people to essentially get their act together and to really study the Black experience, to learn about slavery, but not only slavery, to learn about the 100 or so years of racist policies after slavery.
Think about how patronizing that is. White people are agents. They can be prevailed upon. They can be bad. They can be evil. They can be racist, or they can be prevailed upon to be better. And Black people's condition is completely dependent on whether they are prevailed upon or not, whether we can somehow reach their their conscience. But black people are somehow not agents at all, and can't change and can't be prevailed upon to behave in better or worse ways. We're just waiting to receive white people move first, and we just react.
Yeah, we're
that's incredible to me.
Right.
And that's not how I saw Black life in my home, and it's never been how I've thought of my own situation.
It's a very radical claim. And I mean radical in the sense that the vast majority of Black people on its face wouldn't view themselves that way or anyone they know that way. It's the kind of claim that I think you can only really believe if you are hyper educated. And I don't mean to say that there are no
I think you're right about that.
non-professors who buy into this worldview, but it's very counterintuitive. It is a kind of picture of like Black people as a collective weather vane, and what direction we're pointing is just a consequence of which way the wind is blowing.
The wind is white people.
Essentially, yeah. The wind is white people.
And they can blow any way. They can choose which way they blow. I mean,
right.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. And I remember having this argument with this woman, and we ended up kind of coming to common points of agreement, and it was a fruitful argument. But what she kept coming back to, no matter what point I made, was these stories. A Black person getting kicked out of a swimming pool, a Black person in Starbucks getting arrested where arguably a white person might not have. These stories were like a knockdown argument against anything I said, in her mind at least. And she was a sophisticated person. I mean, she was like a superintendent of schools here. And I thought to myself, I've always taken for granted that these stories happen. I mean, like
some of those stories have happened to you and me.
That's right. And it's not a rejoinder to my argument about how, if you look at the number of hours that on average people study by race, you find exactly what the caricature or stereotype would be, which is to say Black kids study on average less than white kids, who study on average fewer hours than Asian kids. And when we see that there's an achievement gap and we draw a link, and yes, we can talk about the structural components that feed into that. And
you'd have to talk about how Black kids are treated in schools on balance. In my own experience, I'm certainly willing to concede that Black kids are given far less the benefit of the doubt in disciplinary interactions and all types of things, and are tracked. But it's still like the amount of hours you spend studying goes a long way.
Yeah. And also, part of what I was arguing with this woman about was disciplining students in schools. And it's hard for me to have a strong opinion on this that's not merely a reflection of my pre-existing political beliefs. And I'm very open to like being persuaded that her point of view is correct, which is that really there should be no statistical difference in the degree to which kids are punished, expelled, suspended based on race. If it's 10%, if it's 5% of white boys getting expelled, that's far too high, but for the sake of argument, it should be 5% of Black boys. There should be no large disparity there. And, again, I'm open to being persuaded here, but is there some law of the universe that states that it need be equal, that all of the behavior on average is equal? I mean, obviously, and we should consider what's at stake here, which is, from what I hear, I've never taught a class. I've never run kids, I've never been in charge of a group of kids at summer camp. But from what I hear, and from what I remember being, a 14-year-old boy, if there is one boy in class that is totally irreverent, but charismatic, rebellious, suddenly I want to impress him. And as a kid who would otherwise be very open to learning, I become disruptive because he's kind of like the alpha in the class that I just want him to think I'm cool. And what that means is I'm going to be as rebellious as possible and ruin the learning experience for everyone in the class. And it could be the case that taking that one kid out of class changes the whole dynamic. So I feel discipline the ability to discipline someone is very important. And if we hamstring teachers in their ability to do that because we presume them to be infected by racial bias, you could be hurting the 95% of kids in class who really are open to learning.
I'm sure I'm not really, I don't study schools or have a deep enough investment in it, but from my own experiences and observations, culture matters, and if you take culture out of some of these discussions, you'll never solve it. You might score points, you might be able to make righteous arguments, but if you dismiss the fact that there is a kind of black youth culture that Orlando Patterson and other sociologists have studied at some length, that prizes a certain type of behavior in, certainly not in all blacks, but in many blacks, especially males. This is what Losing My Cool was really about. If you deny the kind of force of that culture that can reward behavior that is anti-intellectual or that rejects or that leads you to behave in class in a certain way that would get you kicked out, I think you won't get to the answer that we actually want. But I also would never, and this is based on my own experiences and observations too, I would never downplay the amount to which black males especially can be read as being more threatening or more disruptive than they may in fact be. Mm-hmm. Especially when you compare that to the kind of rambunctiousness that can happen with white males. If you look at like lacrosse players or any certain groups of white males can be extraordinarily disruptive, but can be treated in a gentler way, or they're just being kids or they're just being boys. I do buy into the fact that black males can be perceived as being older, more threatening, more violent, more criminal, because racism fundamentally is a flaw in our perception. It's a perceptual error. And I think that black people are often perceived by whites and by other blacks in ways that are detrimental. And I think that there's nothing to do with essences again, but we have to. These are all things that have to be taken into account. I think that cultural practices influence this too. I think that we still live quite segregated lives, and so don't have necessarily as much comfort around. Not all of us have as much comfort around people we perceive as other as we might need to have to be able to understand behavior as innocuous.
So let's talk a little bit about where racism comes from. You do a little bit of sort of in passing intellectual history in the book in terms of where our concept of race comes from in the West. It's old, but it's not ancient. The notion that the human species is divided into races, you say is sort of like an Enlightenment era belief.
Really codifying that now. It starts with like Linnaeus and then Blumenbach in Germany after him, where you had 4 races and then you had 5 races. You know, you had the red race, the Native American. You had the yellow race, the Malay, I believe they called it. You had the Negroid race. You had the Caucasoid race. And the idea was that these are measurable categories and that they have essences and that they're very different, and that whiteness, of course, sits on the top of this hierarchy. That goes back to that's the 1700s. You know, to put that in perspective, I write about this. I've stayed in Weimar. I stayed in an inn that was like several hundred years older than that idea, and it's continuously running. You know, like it's a long. It's been with us for a long time, and it was really reified in the collision of Europe and Africa and the transatlantic slave trade. Race was really made in the New World in ways that really impact us to this day. But if it wasn't always the case, can we not imagine it not being the case in the future? And that's what I think that race really depends on what we can imagine as well.
So what do you think are the prospects of us getting past race? I
think it starts with the imaginary. Like, if we're not even willing, and you know, when you try to say, when Camille says that he's a race abolitionist and he's dark skinned and he says that he's not black, people just laugh at you. You know, not everybody, but a lot of people we dismiss that. But if we can't even say something, if we can't even imagine it, how can we ever enact it? How can we get to a future in which race doesn't matter, if we always behave as though race always matters, that is real. Walter Ben Michaels has this great quote. He says, "We know it's not a biological reality, and we call it a social construct, and then we go ahead and make it exactly the same thing as though it were a biological reality." You know?
Yeah, and but your own life kind of contradicts it, because depending where you've been categorized as different things. In France, you're seen as an Arab or North African. In America, it's unclear what you'd be seen as now, but certainly in your youth, you'd be seen as black.
Balding can change your race.
Yeah, exactly. Like literally something
Whether you have a beard or
trivial
not.
as balding can change how you're
also,
perceived racially.
Body language can, the way you
dress,
your posture can, the way you, the how you dress. These are things that have profoundly changed the way my race is perceived. I read in Losing My Cool about just changing the way that I dressed in college. I didn't understand it purposefully, but the effect of like swapping out extremely baggy kind of, jeans and sweatshirts and hoodies and Timberlands and just wearing like neutral, like form-fitting clothing. I think it changed my racial perception in certain professors' eyes. And I understand the kind of argument that comes with that's respectability politics, whatever. I'm just saying the fact was that race was kind of also hinging on certain very ephemeral characteristics of my appearance that have nothing to do with me, myself,
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the social incentives of identifying as one way or another. This is an argument I've had with friends before, and it's sometimes not gone over particularly smoothly. So, for example, let me speak from...
Because you're mixed.
Yeah, my mother was Puerto Rican. She was Nuyorican, really. She was born in New York, but Spanish-speaking, didn't hear English until she was probably 5 years old or so. South Bronx, and very proud of that fact. And she sort of presented, I always thought of her as Puerto Rican or Nuyorican, but as I got older, I asked some friends how they perceived her, because I always heard the slight Spanish accent, just on certain words like tree or three. She would say three instead of three, just those little things. But she was perceived as a light-skinned black woman, probably partly to do with the fact that her husband and kids were, looked like me. In any case, I always perceived myself as a kid as half Puerto Rican and half black, just sort of naively.
Even though Puerto Rican is not a race.
That's right. Puerto Rican, we don't consider to be a race.
You can be black Puerto Rican.
That's right. And my mother's parents, my mother's father was darker skinned than I, and my mother's mother was much lighter skinned than you, both from the island.
Both Puerto Rican.
Both Puerto Rican. In any event, I perceived myself as half Puerto Rican and half black. But as I grew older, I don't know when it happened, I just became black. I stopped. It might have been a consequence of being forced to check one box often enough that I had to sort of pick a side, so to speak. Might have been the fact that my Spanish deteriorated somewhat.
Your lived reality was not very Puerto Rican. Not very Latino at that point.
That's right. I was very rarely speaking Spanish. I saw the Puerto Rican side of my family, which I had been very entrenched in as a kid, became more and more estranged as a consequence of my mother falling out with some of her siblings as I got older. But I also think there is a sense in which the larger social incentives that I was a part of would lead me to identify as black. If I think about how much visibility the issue of blackness gets in the culture at large versus the issue of, the identity of Hispanicness, there's a huge disparity there, in the sense that if I go to Columbia University, I will hear about sort of black identity more often than I hear about the Hispanic one. There's more visibility. There's more social clout even. And I don't think that it requires any cynicism or sort of conscious effort for a person to find themselves blown in the direction of one identity rather than another, because there is more to be gained from it. I don't think it requires cynicism to do that. I think it's subconscious.
It's very powerful. I mean, it goes in the opposite direction too.
That's right.
My daughter's almost 6 now, and the social pressure pushing her towards whiteness is extraordinary.
Right.
There is power. There is power in a victim identity or in a historically oppressed identity. It's not that all blacks get power out of it, but you can get a power out of your black identity. I understand what you're saying, but it's much clearer how you get a power out of, for someone like my daughter, how she, as opposed to going into her blackness and embracing the one-drop identity, she would get a lot more just by floating into whiteness and not questioning it too much because the world wants to put her there anyway. Mm. And it's something that my wife and I take very seriously, and we try to make sure that she has all the tools and all the understanding to achieve a perspective that would reject the social pressure towards, a kind of easy identity in white privilege. I think that what I'm talking about, rejecting race, what Camille would be talking about, it's nothing that can happen without an extraordinary amount of commitment to something that's very much against the current of where society wants to put you. You have to achieve a perspective that would reject race means that you have to really stand apart, literally. The social pressures are so real. I know you were saying in terms of having social pressure towards blackness, you're not rejecting your blackness, actually, right?
I mean, at this point, I could describe myself as black as a merely descriptive matter, in the sense you said it's a negotiation between you and society. It so happens if you're a person who looks like I do in 2019 on this portion of the earth, the word for you tends to be black. My blackness, I think, goes really no deeper than that. Maybe it has there's a cultural sense in terms of the music I love is disproportionately black.
And I would describe myself as culturally black as well.
Right. And in some other ways, I'm not culturally black. I mean, music is probably the domain in which I'm the most culturally black. But in terms of food preferences, dress, I'm not sure. I'm a amalgamation of many different American tropes.
Yeah, you're American.
Yeah. So, I don't know. What were you making a point there?
Well, I was going to say that, I don't, sometimes, when I have these conversations, sometimes people say, well, I don't want to give up my blackness, but I don't think that very much changes by saying that, you're part of a community and part of a group of people that have certain values, tastes, cultural traditions, but that there's nothing essential about that. But, I think that what we should be focusing on, and I think that the way through this is really to think about America as always having been a fundamentally mixed population. Whether people are mixed in their own families or not is less important than the fact that Americanness is fundamentally WASP. It's fundamentally African, Negro, they used to say. It's fundamentally Native American. There's a kind of pioneer, frontier spirit to American identity. There's a heavily Jewish component. Now there's an Asian and Latino component. There's been for a long time, actually. And that we all have these aspects of each other in us, whether we want to admit it or not. This is what you see when you live in Europe. I've lived in Europe for almost a decade. If a white person and a black person coming from America meet in Paris, they are much more similar to each other than either of them is to the Frenchman or the Afro-Frenchman, the Congolese or the Senegalese. They have much more in common than they have with each other than with the other. And I think that we don't really fully understand that. And so I think that, we could kind of step back from race and get more into a kind of mongrel American social identity that would do a lot to diffuse the intense tribalism that we see raging right now.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you about France in a moment and the differences between how they approach race and how we approach it here. But before I do that, I want to, I have been thinking a lot, and I was recently on a philosophy podcast called The Partially Examined Life, which is quite good. And
it's a good name.
It's a good name and a good podcast. And the topic was social constructionism. What does it mean for something to be socially constructed? Are race and gender socially constructed? concept like mental illness socially constructed. 100 years ago, we would have just said that Timmy has trouble sitting still. Now we say Timmy has, quote, ADHD. That's a social construct, right? Doesn't mean it's not real. In any case, we were talking through these things. And where I've come to is that, at the most fundamental level, what we really know is there in the universe in terms of our theories that have 100% predictive validity are like quarks and atoms. Like physicists, there's when they predict something is going to happen, it just happens, I guess, aside from quantum mechanics. But that's like, if we can say anything with 100% accuracy, it's on that level. Every level higher than that, you get fuzzier and fuzzier, and you get less and less predictive. And our categories become blurrier and blurrier at the borders, to the point where it's very difficult when we're talking on the level of humans and economies to articulate a theory that has no exceptions, articulate a distinction between this kind of people and that kind of people that has no fuzziness. And so when we look out on the world and, we have however many billion humans on this planet, and we ask, how do we divide them up? How many buckets do we put them into? Of course, there's the question, why do you need to do that in the first place? But the answer is that we kind of have to on some questions. But I think the key question when you're asking whether something is a social construct is, if we got rid of this distinction, would we be worse for it? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I don't know if you read George Packer's recent essay in The Atlantic, where he talks about his kids in the New York public school system. And one day his kids came home and they had just gotten rid of gendered bathrooms, sort of.
This
overnight.
is a brilliant part of the piece.
Right. Yeah. And to describe briefly for listeners, so I think these kids were, second or third grade.
They're third grade, I believe, yeah.
Third grade. So we're talking about 8-year-olds who are used to having seen, men's and women's rooms their whole lives. And suddenly they come to school and there are no gendered bathrooms.
And it's chaos. It's chaos for the girls especially.
For the girls especially. You have kids holding it in all day because they're afraid. They don't know where to go. You have boys kicking the doors in on girls' stalls. And over time, they spontaneously on their own dubbed one of the bathrooms for boys and one for girls.
They went to the same ones that used to be.
So the same ones that used to be. So they restore. I mean,
they restored order on their own.
Right, right. This is like porn for a Burkean conservative. This story, but
I found myself in Bard. I'm teaching at Bard this semester, and they have genderless bathrooms. And I walked in after class to a bath. Not. It's fine when there's. You close the door and lock it, but when there's 10 stalls, I walked in, there's a young girl, I'm 38, there's like a 19-year-old girl, it's just me and her in the bathroom, it's insanely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
She didn't look comfortable, I certainly did. I certainly, just like started pretending I had to look in the mirror instead of, it's.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in those bathrooms at Barnard, and I certainly felt the novelty and weirdness of it, but because I was there visiting my girlfriend, and everyone knew everyone on the floor, and it was a very enclosed space. It wasn't really public. It was a private campus. It could work, although with a different guy in a different circumstance.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
like we're becoming alive to the way in which like men are threatening to women, or women are reasonably are well within range to assume that a man can be a threat in a private setting like that. I mean, what is the point of the Me Too movement if not that?
Right.
And at the same time, but the
brilliance of Packer was that the kids figured out their own solution.
They figured out their own solution. And the point of bringing up this story is when we ask whether gender is a social construct, or biological sex even more radically, what I think we should be asking is, if we got rid of it, would we be worse off? And I think clearly in this instance, getting rid of the distinction between boys and girls made everyone worse off, except perhaps the one gender-neutral kid in the school. So the compromise they came to is that they reinstated boys and girls rooms and then also had one gender-neutral bathroom, which I think is a reasonable compromise. The question we should ask with whether race is a social construct is, if we got rid of it, would we be worse off? And my instinct is to say, on most counts, the answer is no. However, to really be fair to someone who would disagree, isn't there an argument to be made that, all we have in life or much of what we have in life are our attachments to particular places, right? I like New York. I know in the abstract, New York is not special. There are cities all around the world that people feel are their home. However, New York is my home, and that makes it special. Is it possible to know at the abstract level that every group of people, that in some sense, behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, you could have been born as a Chinese man? But I was born as a black man in America, and my blackness means something to me. When I meet another black person, this is not me, Coleman Hughes, speaking. This is many.
This is Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking.
Well, yeah, and even people. Yeah,
no, this is of course.
This
could even be me
dad.
speaking.
Yeah,
I understand the nod that you give. But
so do you lose that sense of fraternity, that sense of brotherhood?
That's cultural. You're attached to New York City, but New York City is an objectively real thing. I think that the danger in race is that we're attached to something that most of us are willing to admit is fictitious. New York City is real. Be attached to New York. Be attached to your culture. That's real. Be attached to the people that you feel represent you. But to reify that in a category that we're willing to say doesn't exist, isn't objectively measurable, has caused extraordinary harm, has subjugated certain peoples under other peoples. To hold that up because this pernicious lie has also led to some, and even has led within the press groups to some kind of strong identities that are I'm willing to admit are difficult to let go of. But to hold on to that simply because it's scary to think of what it would be like without it, I think that that's ultimately not the best that we can do. I think that doesn't satisfy the test that I think is really a compelling one about whether we would be better or worse off. I think that most of us, whether we know it or not, would be better off in a world without racial division, because I emphasize this a lot, but I think it's impossible to deny. Racism is only possible. Racism creates race. Race is only possible because of racism, because of our need to kind of have an other, and then to impose hierarchies. Categories are made in the mind. They don't exist in the real world like New York does. So most of us would be better off without that. Certainly black people, certainly non-whites have no incentive to keep going with the racial, with the way that we talk and think about and conceive of race now, with the racial status quo. But I would also argue that whites don't have an incentive either, that racism and this kind of white identity that they've been forced into as well, it dehumanizes them just as much or more as it dehumanizes blacks and Latinos and Asians. So I write about my grandfather was deformed by his racism, and it destroyed his family life. He wasn't able to even have a relationship with his daughter,
right,
because he couldn't get over this superficial skin deep difference that didn't allow him to see his son-in-law as an equal human being.
Right. So you talk
on
about
his deathbed, he said that was the dumbest thing he's ever done in his life.
Wow, that's incredible.
He told my brother, I didn't go to his funeral. He told my brother, he said that when you're dying, skin doesn't really seem to matter so much.
That gives me goosebumps. Wait, but just to give the listeners the details, your maternal grandfather, father of your white mother, used to never visit your family.
That's right. For 40 years.
His wife would, your grandmother would. Yeah. And you talk about not sort of knowing at first why this was. There was always excuses. Oh, he doesn't like to travel.
He's got a bad back.
But it was really that his daughter was married to a black man and had
woolly hair, tan-skinned kids, yeah.
And he couldn't deal with that.
He couldn't deal with it. And he was even aware, admitted that he admitted to other family members that this was racism, but he couldn't get over it. As he was dying, he said that it was a horrible mistake. And I think about it a lot. He had as close of a relationship as I have with my daughter to my mother her entire life up until the moment that she married a black man. And then he lost the entire relationship, and he suffered extraordinarily.
Yeah, so that's a point not often made, that racist people suffer for their racism. At least they often do.
Whether they're able to fully comprehend what they're losing or not, I think not everybody comes to an epiphany on their deathbed, but it deforms you. It deforms you to narrow yourself that way. It deforms you to look at the photos of lynchings and things like that. You see these mobs of white people gathered around a charred body. You would never do that to an animal. You would never do. It's horrific what they're doing. They've turned themselves into monsters. You know, it's the I think there's a case to be made for why white people have an extraordinary incentive to get rid of this status quo that makes them white.
So I think there's so I'm trying to channel my inner Robin DiAngelo here.
That makes them guilty.
Yeah. So this is the author of the book White Fragility. Her idea is essentially that race consciousness needs to permeate white America as well, but in a very specific way. White people need to be made to think of themselves as white rather than as neutral human beings.
I agree with her on that.
Yeah. But further than that, they need to conceive of what their whiteness means as, well, they need to be constantly aware of their privilege. They essentially need to observe the ways in which their whiteness blinds them to racism and how that, where the rubber hits the road with DiAngelo is if you're a white person talking to a black person about some topic that has a racial component,
you immediately must defer to the...
Yes. You must. You're not supposed to argue back. You're not supposed to remain silent.
That's patronizing.
Yeah, it is. But this is the kind of white racial consciousness that she wants to see flourish among America's white people. How do you view that? Where do you agree with her? Where do you think she goes too far?
I think that she starts from an argument that's absolutely correct, which is it's actually something that Richard Spencer argues too, but for different purposes. White people typically are seen as race neutral. Race resides outside of whiteness. Whiteness is the standard from which everything else is a deviation. That's like how most white people, like certainly my mother's generation, have moved through the world. That there's a race problem. That means that like the black problem is a race problem. There's no race problem in white America. So sure, white people, to understand how their identity was constructed, that it had an origin point, that monolithic whiteness as we think of it now, that includes Jews, Italians, and Irish people, like Mediterranean people, Spaniards, Greeks, Portuguese, that is really recent, and that is not what Anglo-Saxons conceived of whiteness as. Even 100 years ago, you know, so it's fluid. Whiteness expands. It lets in certain Latinos now. In different times in the 20th century, Hindus became white, then they became Asian. People don't know what to do with whiteness around the fringes. So to think of whiteness as an actual ethnic identity that was made the same way that minority identities have been made is certainly constructive and helpful. But then the idea that it's some type, she gets beyond that and she makes it into an essence when she says that it necessarily comes with privilege. You must defer. She had this, you know, there was a brilliant review of her book in the New Yorker by Kelefa Sannah, where he mentions that she does these courses and she's very self-conscious to make sure that even if she's moved to tears, she doesn't allow a black man to see her cry because white women's tears have been historically weaponized. You know, this is getting into the realm of, she's back to putting herself in a kind of white supremacy, actually, through the back door, and I'm sure it's by accident, but it achieves the same thing. Richard Spencer just wants her to become aware of her specialness and embrace it. She's still claiming to be special, that her tears hold power, that she can't even, that a black life is so fragile in front of her white tears that it has to be guarded, you know, that she has to preemptively guard. And so I think that she ends up making some of the same mistakes. She gets into a kind of essential vision of race that's counterproductive. And the idea that all white people have privilege, I mean, I can't, that's something that, is white privilege in some abstract way real? Sure. Am I more privileged than my mother? Yeah, I am. Am I more privileged in some ways than my wife as an American and she's French? I absolutely am. So it gets very difficult for me to parse privilege. And that again comes back to the conversation we're having with the SAT and stuff. When you make these claims about very large groups that are based on abstract definitions of identity, it falls apart. I'm not even sure that Robin DiAngelo is more privileged than you are. I'm not sure that she's had, that she's been to the type of schools that you've been, you know?
Yeah.
It's difficult. Maybe her father didn't work in Wall Street. You know, like there are different ways to be privileged, and to reduce it to, her last name is Italian. She's just arrived at whiteness as far as I'm concerned, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when it comes to privilege, and I mean, I think it's very important as a human being trying to live a responsible life, trying to understand, you know, the forces that have conspired to put you where you are, to think about privilege in all its forms. So, you know, like just earlier in the conversation, I was essentially meditating on the way in which being black has given me a privilege in a narrow sense, in the sense of, you know, the moment I'm checking the box. You know, I remember being a senior in high school, and I had a very good friend. One of my best friends was second generation Chinese American, and we took all the same classes, basically got all the same grades, would study together often. And then the moment we applied to college, there was this sort of big there's a vast chasm between how stressed he was and how stressed I was. Because, you know, he took the SAT
because you're not a stressed out guy to begin with, though. That's also a form of privilege.
Well, at that time, I was actually very stressed. I was very, I think this is probably something that happened around the time my mom died. But before that, I was like, I would wake up at 5 a.m. and do all my homework perfectly, because I just had this kind of, I was very driven, but in a naive way. I didn't ask why I was trying to get good grades. I just kind of did it reflexively. It was sort of unaware, in a sort of unaware way. But in any case, at that moment, in that narrow context, again, which is not to discount all the other ways and all the other situations in which he would have been at more of an advantage than I was. When, you know, senior fall, he was way more stressed than I was, because he knew that it was going to be way harder for him to get into an elite school than it was for me.
And the facts prove that. Yeah, the numbers are on his side.
And we're, you know, his parents spoke broken English. My parents spoke very good English. Like they're in any event, that was a meditation for me on a certain way in which I'm privileged. And I think that is, you know, it's important to recognize that in society. Part of what I find to be disingenuous about the notion of white privilege is that if we're going to talk about privilege, we should really talk about privilege in all its forms.
I agree with you 100%. If we're going to talk about privilege in all its forms, can I just say that I didn't meet kind of elite white kids until I got to undergrad, and then more and more in the type of work I did and in the places that I lived, the kind of white people that I knew tended to be more and more upper middle class. Mm-hmm. I have always felt that, and I don't want to, you know, speak too broadly, but there is a kind of meaninglessness that can come in upper middle class white life when all your needs are taken care of, when you don't see your parents because they work a lot, whatever. That coming from my financially much less well-to-do background, with a family that didn't have a ton of disposable income, so spent a lot of time together, cared about each other a lot, spoke all the time. I felt that I had privileges over some of these. I felt that coming from a background that had seen our family story was one of struggle and overcoming. My father overcoming the Jim Crow South, my parents overcoming being married right after loving Virginia and having all types of ostracism from that, coming together into this loving family and just making ourselves against adversity. I felt that my life was infused with meaning that oftentimes I didn't see in some of my friends that were supposed to be privileged above me. And I even think that in some ways that's helped me as a writer. I'm not willing to accept that they were privileged over me, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's very much out of vogue to say something like that. That's something that I detect in the writing of Ralph Ellison. It's something that I detect in the black writing of Albert Murray. and it's something that I feel in my bones. It's something that's the Black tradition that really resonates with me. I reject that having two lawyers at home who work 75 hours a week and you're raised by a nanny is a privilege over having parents who have no retirement savings but love you to death and are there for you every moment. You know?
Yeah, and the way you describe your father in both of your books is just as like a brilliant self-taught individual who invested so much time and energy in you and was just so clearly intelligent, right? Like that, like you describe a father that most people would really die to have. And
I was always aware that was a privilege, though that's not
Right.
not counted in the way we talk about these things,
Right.
you know?
And I think it touches on a different thing I've thought recently, which is everyone would acknowledge in the abstract that man does not live by bread alone, that economic power is one of many types of power. Life is not all about money. However, when we talk about the intersection of race and privilege,
It's all about money.
it's all about money. We talk about the wealth gap. We live in a stratified society, people would say, because white people have more wealth than black people, and they do, a lot more on average, higher incomes on average. However, economic power is not the only type of power, and I would argue if we're talking about cultural or rhetorical power, black people have more of it at this point. That was not always true. But, for example, if we're talking about the power to enforce what offends your group, enforce the taboos that you want to see other groups observe. For example, the N-word. No matter how much power you have, if you are CEO of a company right now and you're white, if you say the N-word, even in a non-racist context where you're just referring to the word, you're done.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, if white people had much more cultural power than black people, then presumably you would be able to say things like, I'm white and I'm proud of being white. I don't hate other people, but I'm proud of my whiteness. In the same way that if I said that as a black person, that would have no implications, no negative ones for my career, right? So black people have the cultural power to say something like that. White people don't. So I think when we're talking about privilege and power, we shouldn't be so narrowly focused on economics, though that's very important.
The power of moral authority
Yeah.
matters, but I agree with you. But I think that there's also power in seeing your life as having meaning, and I think that we often cheapen the conversation about well-being. Of course, money matters. Below a certain level, obviously, money matters. But when I really think about it, if your needs are taken care of, when I say my wife comes from from a family that's passed on houses. My mother does too. My father comes from a family that did own some homes, but it was always more tenuous. And my mother inherited more than he inherited. Nothing lavish, but a bit more. I refuse to believe that the equality of our lives or that the meaning in our lives derives from how many tens of thousands of dollars more my mother inherited. I mean, at a certain point, are we housing and sheltering ourselves? Do we have opportunities? Are we living? Are we able to flourish? I don't see myself as being prohibited from flourishing, coming down to whether or not I'm able to inherit a modest home. I see whether I'm able to do the work that I want, save up for my own home. But I feel like oftentimes I don't want to trivialize these things, but oftentimes the conversation comes down to whether I pay back student loans or my white friend does not. That's not where the meaning of my life comes from.
And I think people would recognize this if the conversation were on any other topic. People on the left, I think, are quick to say, and rightly, that Homo economicus, this view of people as perfectly rational actors that always pursue financial gain to the degree that the laws of supply and demand, yada yada yada, like the model of the human being predicted in an economics textbook is not exactly how human beings are at all. People often go for careers that are far less remunerative than they could because they get more meaning there. This happens all the time.
I mean,
people become monks.
That's what I
in this
absolutely
world. Like people become monks, and like that happens, and it's just as much a consequence of their humanity as someone who just pursues financial gain. In any event, let's pivot slightly. Last thing I want to ask you is France. You live in France, and you have for how long?
Since 2011.
Since 2011.
And one year briefly after undergrad in 2003-4.
What have you noticed that's different about how the way the French treat the issue of race, how you felt living in France, and France's somewhat famous policy of sort of not being officially
the Republican
colorblind.
ideal. Yeah, the Republican
in the sense
ideal.
That they, if I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, they don't actually count people by race.
They don't.
On the census, and if you're a scholar, you sort of can't even really get access to information about how many Africans,
it's frustrating
for
to scholars
yeah.
for some, like you can't measure whether the criminal justice system is biased in certain ways because everybody in jail is just French, even though it's overwhelmingly Arab and black.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting contrast to it. Neither system works perfectly because the French are no less racist than Americans are. But it is interesting to live in a society that never had slavery within its own borders. So the law of hypodescent, which has kind of been running through the conversation a bit, the one-drop rule, and like the idea that blackness and whiteness is binary, in my experience in France, is not how most Europeans understand race. It's very strange for the French people I speak to who know that my daughter and my son are mixed. It's very strange for them to think that in America their identity could even plausibly be constructed as black. And for many people that I talk to, it's hard for them to fully understand why my identity could be as well. So the binary thing is something that it can feel freeing to be out of. You know, it's not, French people are much more concerned or interested in origins. So where do you come from? So my primary identity in France has been American. I can be perceived as North African or something, but as soon as I open my mouth, it's clear that I'm American. And then that kind of like dominates people's idea of me. And this has been why a place like France has long been a kind of haven for Black American GIs and jazz players and writers, because for many of them, like James Baldwin writes about this so eloquently, it was the first time in their lives they'd felt American, you know? Because in America, oftentimes Black life has been something not fully American. I don't deny that at all. So living in France has been eye-opening that way. There are long stretches. I work thinking about race all the time, and I write about it and I read about it. But there have been long stretches in France where where my race recedes entirely from my lived experience. Where I walk down the street and I'm not even aware of a cop because it doesn't even. There's no interaction in which my having Black ancestry conditions my life there. And I think that that's extraordinarily liberating. And also the kind of the obsession with measuring groups and with the identity politics conversation. Some people in France would argue that that's it's problematic that they don't have enough identity politics. That's a growing kind of point on the left, that they need more American-style identity politics. But I would say that if you designed a perfect society, it would resemble more France's way than America's. The flaw is that the French don't live their lives as though the Republican ideal is real. So the French live intensely segregated lives. White, liberal, bourgeois French people still barely socialize with people that are not white, bourgeois. And often that has a lot to do with class, but certainly it has to do with some, Muslims, North Africans, Blacks from former colonies are kept outside of mainstream society in a way that seems more difficult to transcend than minorities in America are. I'm not enough of an expert to get to the bottom of how that could be solved in France, but I know that living there as an American, you can kind of be aware of the society failing on some levels, but also be oddly aware that it's not failing you. This is what James Baldwin wrote about very well, that you're aware that someone else occupies the position of nigger in France and occupies the position you're accustomed to back home.
So do you think if the French got rid of that model and started counting people of different races on the census and coming up with percentages and allowing people to study, do you think that would have net good consequences or bad consequences?
I'm unable to say what the consequences on specifically needing to know about the criminal justice system would be. I imagine that actually it would be helpful to know how much Arabs, for example, are railroaded. That probably would be helpful. But basically, the French recently struck the word race completely from all their legal documents. Their thinking was, if race isn't real, why do we have it encoded and enshrined in our Constitution and things like that? I think that's absolutely the right direction to move in. I would love that to be the case in America. If race isn't real, why does that word carry pseudoscientific weight, right? Net gain, net loss. I would say it would be a net loss if French society moved towards American-style identity politics.
Yeah, and I think whenever I've thought of France, I've thought that I want America to voluntarily become slightly more like France, which is to say, I think people should be allowed to study whatever they want, including race, and I would be very uncomfortable with a mandate that they couldn't. But I would want people to become less interested in it. Mm-hmm. Like, regardless of what is true biologically, like we think of something, and we touched on the fact that there could be differences in the likelihood of getting some disease or whatever. Think of something like blood type, undeniably biologically real and important to know in some contexts. Like when you go to the doctor, you want to know your blood type.
But most of us don't even know what it is. We have to look it up.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in certain contexts, it becomes suddenly crucial in certain contexts, and then you forget about it where it's not. I want race to become more and more like blood type, even if there's something biologically to it with prevalence of disease or something akin to that. Like, to me, that just seems orthogonal. Like your race really can recede, like as it has done for you in France, and I've noticed the same thing in certain contexts. And I think we have to be pushing towards that more
Absolutely.
and more.
I want to push towards a society where how you look tells me as little as possible about who you are, mm-hmm. and what you're into, what you're doing, where you're from. That your nose and your hair and the concentration of melanin in your skin doesn't give me enough information to draw a conclusion. That's a society. People are gonna look different than each other, but I don't want those differences to mean more than your blood type. That's a very good image to put it with.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Thomas, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And your book, what is the name of your book and where can people get it?
Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race, and it should be wherever books are sold.
Beautiful. Thanks.
Thank you.